Hello everyone and welcome back to another video on the channel. Today we are going to be talking about Ahsoka episode 4. Now this is a series I have been absolutely loving so far. It's not a perfect series, I have some flaws here and there, and I'll get into some of those later on in this video, but overall I've been absolutely loving the journey that this series is bringing me on, and this episode in particular had a lot of great stuff, a lot of great, climax at the midpoint of this series that's going to grow out to the back half of the season. And I think that this show, despite its shortcomings, has had a great pace. At least for me, it's had a great pace and knows exactly when to start an episode, when to end an episode, and how to build up in a very engaging way. And that's exactly what this episode did for me. So we will be talking about spoilers for episode 4 of Ahsoka. So if you have not seen the episode just yet, go check it out on Disney Plus. I highly recommend it because I am really enjoying this show. So let's just get into the episode. So the last episode left off with Ahsoka and Sabine going off to confront Morgan Elsbeth, who has created this hyperspace ring to go across to a different galaxy to figure out exactly where Thrawn is to bring him back as the heir to the Empire. Of course, she's getting help from BAYLAN and Shin, who are some great antagonists in this series, and that's exactly where we pick off this episode. We have Ahsoka and Sabine on the ground now after, doing the whole space battle in the last episode, and they're going to confront them head on in this little, temple of sorts on the edge of this cliff, and you get a lot of great lightsaber action. You get to see a great duel between Ahsoka and Marok, who we'll get to in a second here, and of course we have Sabine with her continuing rivalry with Shin in this series, and then also you get to have a phenomenal confrontation between Ahsoka and BAYLAN, which was easily the highlight of the episode, besides maybe that very, very last scene. But let's get into Marok first, because this is the character that I've been talking about throughout all my reviews so far in this series, and yes, I was wrong. This character is not necessarily meaningless. I think this character played a really great red herring for the fans to speculate and to try to figure out who this character is. Is this character somebody important, or are they just another pawn for Morgan and Elsbeth to use to throw out our heroes? And that's exactly who he was. And yes, you can quote me on saying that I did think that that was Ezra in my last few videos, and I'll stand by my theories and by my false assumptions of what they're going to do in this show. But when Ahsoka sliced him in half and it revealed that he was just like this energy that Morgan Elsbeth has used her, witchcraft to create this character that is kind of, helping the evil, they're not even really evil, they're not Sith, they're not Jedi, the BAYLAN character is just another character to help them out as kind of, the muscle of the team. That's exactly what he was, and I don't mind this mainly because I enjoyed being wrong. Whenever somebody theorizes about a show, I feel like especially on YouTube, there's a sense of, shame when somebody gets wrong. They're like, oh, how dare you, you're so dumb, you thought it was this way. No, that's the fun in a week-by-week show. It's where you can speculate and have theories and, think, oh, is the show going to go this way? Is the show going to go this way? Is it going to subvert my expectations? I think the easy thing for the show to do would be to make this somebody of importance. It would be to make them some sort of a cameo of sorts. I think some of the theories with this being another Elseworlds type character, like, Sam Witwer returning as Starkiller, you always had those really bizarre and out there theories, which, that's fun to speculate about those things. And in this case, we were all just extremely wrong, and I found it extremely funny the way that it played out in this episode. I had a really good laugh at that. Just, it's fun to theorize, especially in a week-to-week show. I love shows that go week-to-week. I grew up watching Lost week-to-week, so I love the thrill of guessing those things and inevitably getting it wrong. Of course, this show doesn't have as much of a thrill that show had, that's being one of the greatest shows to do that sort of thing, but I thought it worked pretty well here, and I'm glad that it wasn't anybody, because you got to have, the confrontation with Ahsoka and BAYLAN that actually mattered. And like I said, the rivalry between Shin and Sabine also continued in this episode, and for some reason, I think this rivalry, or just this character of Shin, really does work. I think this actress has a sort of intensity to her, a sort of loose cannon aspect to her character that feels like she's always going to be unpredictable and a little more, crazy than the more, settled and more stoic and more, I guess, calculating BAYLAN character. I think they make a really great duo, a really great contrasting dynamic between a master and an apprentice, and she just has such a great performance, such great looks, such great, dialogue, and I think that these characters in particular are easily the most interesting in the entire series. But that confrontation between Sabine, being in full helmets, full Mandalorian gear, was also great to see her fighting with her Mandalorian style, occasionally bringing out her lightsaber, but she's very much not ready to use the Force just yet. She has one moment in this fight where she uses the Force to push Shin back, and she just says, you have absolutely no power. Just such a dig to Sabine, and you can only imagine how much that hurts her to feel like she's not succeeding in the ways that she needs to succeed to beat these characters, which kind of, I guess, informs her decision later on in this episode. But I think this rivalry is building up to something that will probably be extremely satisfying by the end of this series, where whether they end up fighting by the end of the show and Shin ends up dying at Sabine's hands or something in that nature. I imagine that's how this this is going to go down by the end of it. But as of right now, I really like this rivalry. And getting into BAYLAN and Ahsoka's duel, what I loved most about this fight in particular is they are both very calculated characters. They are both characters that will step back, kind of assess the situation, and kind of face off in a way it feels more like an actual samurai movie, which of course Dave Filoni is a massive fan of those type of storylines, especially in that episode that Ahsoka was in Mandalorian. It had that, samurai Jedi type of feel, and that's exactly what this episode has with BAYLAN and Ahsoka. And BAYLAN also has this imposing force to him where he has very calculated and very strong moves, and I guess his presence in general is just extremely intense and in your face, and all his movements are so jagged and so tense and so powerful. And Ahsoka is, a little more quick, a little more, careful with how she maneuvers and how she does things, but she's clearly facing against somebody that is better than her in a lot of different ways. And so I think this is also a really great dynamic to have with this new rivalry forming in this series. And again, very curious to see where these characters go beyond this point, but I just love all the choreography and all the fights in this show that are, different from the prequels, more, very choreographed, very, ballerina-esque, like a dance-like fight between Obi-Wan and Anakin, whereas this one is much more of that calculated samurai type feel. But even the Sabine and Shin fight was a lot more, scrappy because of how those characters are. So each fight scene seems dynamic to the characters themselves, which I think that the show is doing a really great job at portraying. And of course, this only being the midpoint of the series, you're going to have Ahsoka lose this fight. She gets knocked off the cliff right towards the end. You also get a great emotional beat with her character during this fight where she believes that, Sabine was taken out by Shin when Shin shows up after the midpoint, I guess the climax of this fight, and she has this look of despair on her face that she feels that she has lost her apprentice, that she has failed her apprentice. And you never want to see that from a teacher or from a master in Star Wars, and you get to see that from her performance here before she gets knocked off the cliff. But then even Sabine, in her terror of watching this happen, and wants to take this map and not destroy it, to keep this thing so she can find Ezra, to go after her own personal desires rather than doing the greater thing, which would be to destroy this map and losing Ezra forever, but keeping all these villains from getting what they want. She cannot do that, and I find her character easily the most interesting in terms of our heroes of this season. I think that's Mary Elizabeth Winstead is probably the best in terms of the adaptation from animated to live action. I think that she is doing a fantastic job as Hera, but I think that Sabine, in terms of the characterizations with all our hero characters, even including Ahsoka, has had the most depth to her character. And you also get a nice line of BAYLAN saying that her family did die on Mandalore, which I think a lot of people were speculating about what happened to her family. Were they on Mandalore when the Great Purge happened? And that's exactly what I can assume has happened. So that also does kind of inform why these characters are a little bit more serious this time around. They're a little more stoic and a little less, animated and fun that they were in their animated counterparts. And, Sabine's decision to take that orb and to give it to BAYLAN and to go off on this journey with them across to another galaxy to find Ezra, I feel like makes sense for this character at this point in her story. And I'm very curious to see what her arc is by the end of this. Is she going to regret this decision? Is this going to end up being a good thing? How in the world is Ahsoka and Hera going to go travel across the entire galaxy to follow them? But of course, now you have the final scene of this episode where you have Ahsoka waking up in the world between worlds, which I know anybody who's a fan of Rebels, who loves that final season, has to be so excited to see this in live action. I think it looked phenomenal, just a little glimpse that we got from it. And, if you haven't seen Rebels, if you're new to the show and you have no idea what in the world you just saw, and you see Hayden Christensen back as Anakin Skywalker saying hi to Snips, all these references to Clone Wars and Rebels is just going to go completely over their head. But as a fan of both of those shows, and as a very, intriguing concept being the world between worlds, I am so excited to see how they delve into this in the show. And I've always heard, before I watched Rebels, that the world between worlds was like a time travel element in Star Wars, but that is very much a wrong way to describe what it is. At least the way that I see it, a time travel element is a lot more sci-fi than, fantasy. And I think Star Wars has a great balance between sci-fi and fantasy, but Star Wars always excels when it, highlights and focuses on that fantastical element. And the way that I see that how time and space works with the Force is much more of a mystical and fantastical fantastical representation of these things. So when you're walking through the world between worlds, yes, you see all these moments in time, but they use those moments in time to kind of inform those characters, to give them the arc that they need. And yes, in Rebels, Ezra did pull Ahsoka out of that, confrontation with Vader and saved her in that way. And was it time travel? Was it, doing all these weird things? Yeah, I guess you can argue that, because technically it was time travel. But again, this whole world between worlds was more of a way to progress Ezra's storyline in terms of him accepting the death of Kanan, to push him in the direction that he needed to go. The one final lesson from Kanan to Ezra to push him to be the best Jedi that he could be by the end of Rebels. That's exactly what I think is going to happen in this show with Ahsoka. One final lesson from Anakin to apprentice Snips, to the apprentice of Ahsoka, whether we're going to see some flashbacks, through those little portals, some windows into some moments from Clone Wars or Rebels, or any of that scene in live action. That would be extremely cool to see, or whether it's new moments between these characters that we've never seen before in Clone Wars, or, the Tales of the Jedi, some of the stuff that we saw in there. So I'm hoping for some completely new stuff, some added context that was in the era of Clone Wars. And I think Hayden Christensen looked great in this role. I don't know if they did any of that de-aging technology with him, but I think him just in the costume in general looked really good, and I'm very excited to see what his role is going to be in the next episode, which of course is going to be extremely cool to see and very fan servicey. But at the same time, if it serves the purpose of pushing Ahsoka to where she needs to go to make her character more interesting, I hope to get that. But let's get into some of my criticisms with this episode, which does kind of push into what I just said with Ahsoka, pushing her into a more interesting, characterization, a little more interesting of an arc for her as a character, because I think as of right now, Ahsoka is very stoic and very, stoic, and she's very serious whenever she has a line. She's very slowly speaking. I do think that is more in line with how Ahsoka was, especially in the World Between Worlds episode between Ahsoka and Ezra, and those conversations that they had in that episode, where she is more serious, she's more hardened and more, changed by the fact that she learned what happened to Anakin and him turning into Vader and him doing all of those terrible things at the Jedi Temple. You can only imagine how much that can change her character as a whole. And so yes, you do get that version of her in this series, but I'm hoping that one more, lesson from Anakin past the grave, past this point in time, can push her into being the more lighthearted version of Ahsoka that we all want her to be, really, from this show. And I think there's a possibility of doing it. I do get the creative decision from Dave Filoni and all the creative team behind the show to make her the way that she is in this show. And I don't necessarily think that Rosario Dawson is doing a bad job. Honestly, I think she's doing a great job playing what they have given her on the screen. I just hope that they have a little bit more for this character to do, because the show is called Ahsoka, and Rosario Dawson has a lot more range than just stoic and, the Jedi regal presence that she has in this show, and she's playing it very well. But again, I want to see her kind of break through that and kind of get to the Ahsoka is a little more fun. And I think my points with Ahsoka can be perfectly seen, especially in this episode. I think this has been the most glaring, example of what people have been feeling with her character in this show. And that is the scene where she's talking to Sabine outside of the ship at the beginning of the episode, saying, oh, you might have to make the difficult choice of choosing to destroy this map versus go find Ezra. And then, a couple scenes happen, and not even 3 or 4 minutes later, they're back on the ship and they're talking about the exact same thing. And Ahsoka's basically making the same point. It's like, oh, I think you're going to have to put aside your personal feelings and do what is right. And that's literally the exact same conversation between these two characters within a 5-minute time span, where you haven't progressed these characters' knowledge or these characters', relationship or dynamic whatsoever. You're just kind of repeating the same beats over and over again. And the conversation is very slow and repetitive, and we've already been there and done that. And I feel like there's times in the show where, yes, I like that this show is taking its time to present us with these character moments, but give us different character moments, maybe give us more variety and actually push these characters to more interesting directions, because it's the exact same conversation twice in this singular episode. And I think that is the issue that a lot of people are having. But again, I think that the whole thing with Ahsoka and Anakin and this lesson that she's going to learn in the World Between Worlds can really inform her character to make a lot more interesting choices. And especially when those characters meet up again with Ahsoka after having this experience with Anakin, and Sabine having this experience finding Ezra again, what will these characters do when they reunite after learning all the lessons that they need to learn in order to progress this, master and apprentice relationship, and how is this going to end in the final episode. Again, we're only halfway through this series, so a lot can happen by the end of the series to make me either love this dynamic that these characters have or to kind of fall off of it, because right now I was loving it at first, now it's getting a little bit repetitive, and we'll see where we go from here. But those are going to be my thoughts on Ahsoka episode 4. What did you guys think of this episode? I absolutely loved it. I think this show is a lot more hits than miss. I think Peter Ramsey, as well as the director of this episode, who did Into the Spider-Verse, I'll always mention that he did Into the Spider-Verse because I think he's a very phenomenal director. He did some episodes of Mandalorian as well. He's very, very talented. I'm very glad that he had easily the best episode of this show thus far. So what did you guys think of Ahsoka episode 4? Leave a comment down below, all your thoughts and all your theories of what's going to happen next. We'll see if we get our next theories wrong, but who knows exactly what will happen in this show. And of course, if you enjoyed this review, make sure you guys subscribe to the channel to see more reviews just like this one. And if you want to see some horror reviews, October is coming up. I'm going to be doing a bunch of horror movies like The Nun 2, which comes out this weekend, but I just reviewed Slaughterhouse, which is a really ridiculous horror comedy that just was released for a singular day in theaters, and it was interesting.
It's a slaughterhouse.
Oh.
So like I said, comment down below, leave a like, subscribe to the channel. I hope to see you all in my next one.